You know what keeps me awake at night? It's not the late night comedy writers scrambling for material. Trust me, we have plenty. It's watching politicians who built their entire careers on unwavering loyalty suddenly discover they have a breaking point. And folks, we just witnessed something extraordinary. Most people think Marjorie Taylor Greene's announcement to leave Congress on January 5th, according to unconfirmed reports, was just another political resignation. But what if I told you there's a hidden story here that reveals the true fragility of American democracy? What if this decision exposes a pattern that could reshape how we understand power in Washington? I've been studying political theater for decades, and I can tell you this. When someone like Greene, who literally called herself Trump's most loyal supporter, suddenly talks about refusing to be a battered wife, you're not just witnessing a career change. You're watching the unraveling of something much bigger. Let me take you inside a conversation that supposedly happened between Greene and Trump's inner circle just weeks ago. Picture this, a woman who spent years defending every controversial tweet, every policy reversal, every broken promise, suddenly sitting across from the people who helped build her political identity. And according to sources close to the situation, she looked them dead in the eye and said something nobody saw coming. But to understand why that moment was so seismic, you need to know about the three specific issues that reportedly drove her to this breaking point. Three issues that reveal everything about how Trump really operates when loyalty becomes inconvenient. The first crack appeared over health insurance subsidies. Now, stay with me here. I know healthcare policy sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry in C-SPAN, but this is where it gets fascinating. Greene, who built her reputation attacking the Affordable Care Act, suddenly found herself defending the very subsidies she once called socialist propaganda. Why? Because she started getting calls from constituents in her district whose lives literally depended on those subsidies. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You've spent years railing against something only to discover it's keeping your own voters alive. That's not just a policy disagreement, that's an identity crisis. And when she brought these concerns to Trump's team, expecting some nuanced discussion about serving their voters, what do you think happened? They told her to stick to the script. The second issue was even more revealing, artificial intelligence regulation. Greene, who's never been accused of being a tech policy wonk, suddenly became one of the most vocal advocates for reining in big tech companies. She reportedly told colleagues that letting tech oligarchs write their own rules was exactly the kind of corporate capture Trump claimed to oppose. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that should terrify anyone who believes in principled governance. When Greene pushed for actual AI oversight, she was told it would hurt relationships with key donors, not voters, not principals, donors. That's when she realized something that should chill every American. The movement she dedicated her career to wasn't about draining the swamp. It was about choosing which creatures got to swim in it. But the third issue, this is where the story takes a turn that even I didn't see coming, the Epstein files. When Congress moved to release those documents, Greene found herself in an impossible position. On one side, her constituents demanding transparency. On the other, a political apparatus suddenly very interested in limiting that transparency. According to sources who witnessed these conversations, Greene asked a simple question that changed everything. If we're really about exposing the corrupt elite, why are we protecting any of them? The silence that followed that question told her everything she needed to know. Now, here's what makes this story truly extraordinary and why it matters for every American, not just political junkies. Greene's breaking point wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about conservative versus liberal principles. It was about discovering that the movement she'd helped build had one rule above all others. Loyalty to Trump superseded everything else, including the truth. Think about what that means for a democracy. When loyalty to an individual becomes more important than loyalty to principles, to constituents, to the Constitution itself, you don't have a political movement anymore. You have something much more dangerous. But Greene's story gets even more complex when you consider her relationship with the broader MAGA coalition. She reportedly told confidants that she felt like she was being asked to defend positions that hurt the very people who elected her. Healthcare cuts that would devastate rural hospitals. Deregulation that would empower the same corporate interests Trump claimed to oppose. Foreign policy positions that sounded suspiciously like the neoconservative agenda she'd once criticized. The breaking point, according to multiple sources, came during a private meeting where she was told that questioning these positions made her disloyal. Not wrong, not principled, disloyal. That's when she reportedly used the phrase that's been making headlines. She refused to be a battered wife in an abusive political relationship. Think about the courage that takes. Here's a woman who built her entire political identity around unwavering support, suddenly realizing that unwavering support was being used to compromise everything she claimed to believe in. But here's what should really concern us. If someone as committed as Greene could reach a breaking point, what does that say about the sustainability of a movement built entirely on personal loyalty? What happens when other politicians start asking the same question she asked? The ripple effects are already starting. Reports suggest that other members of the MAGA caucus are quietly expressing similar concerns. Not publicly, they're not that brave yet, but privately, in conversations with trusted staffers, in late-night phone calls with family members who've watched them struggle with these contradictions. This isn't just about Marjorie Taylor Greene anymore. This is about what happens when a political movement discovers it has no foundational principles beyond loyalty to one person, and what happens when that person demands loyalty that conflicts with serving the people who elected you. The tragedy here isn't that Greene is leaving Congress. The tragedy is that it took this long for someone in her position to recognize what should have been obvious from the beginning. Democracy doesn't work when it becomes a personality cult. As I watched the news of her decision break, I couldn't help but think about all the other politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike, who've compromised their principles for political expedience. How many of them are watching Greene's story and seeing their own futures? How many are wondering if they'll have the courage to choose principles over party when their moment comes? Because that moment is coming for all of them. In a democracy, it always does. But there's another layer to this story that most people missed completely, something that connects Greene's decision to a much larger pattern that's been playing out behind closed doors for months. Remember Ro Khanna's involvement in the Epstein Files legislation? That wasn't coincidental. According to sources familiar with the internal dynamics, there's been a growing coalition of politicians from both parties, yes, both parties, who've been quietly coordinating on transparency issues, not because they suddenly love each other, but because they've all reached the same terrifying conclusion. The system is more corrupt than any of them initially realized. Greene's departure isn't happening in isolation. It's part of what insiders are calling the Great Awakening, not the QAnon version, but something far more pragmatic and potentially more dangerous to the political establishment. Politicians who've spent years playing partisan games are starting to realize that the game itself is rigged against everyone except a very small group of ultra-wealthy donors and corporate interests. Here's what should terrify both parties. When politicians stop seeing their opponents as enemies and start seeing the system itself as the problem, everything changes. The traditional left-right paradigm that keeps voters divided while elites consolidate power, that starts to crumble. I've been told by multiple sources that Greene's final straw wasn't actually any of the policy disagreements I mentioned earlier. It was a conversation about her political future where she was explicitly told that her role was to be controversial, to generate outrage, to keep her base angry and engaged, but never ever to actually solve problems. Because solved problems don't generate donations, resolve conflicts don't drive voter turnout, happy constituents don't click on fundraising emails. Think about that for a moment. She was told, in essence, that her job wasn't to represent her district. Her job was to be a profitable performance artist in the theater of American democracy. That's when she realized she wasn't a legislator. She was a character in someone else's story. And that character's purpose was to keep real change from ever happening. The most chilling part, this conversation wasn't unique to Greene. Multiple sources suggest that similar conversations happen regularly with politicians across the spectrum. The only difference is that most of them accept it as the cost of doing business. Greene, for all her flaws, apparently reached a point where she couldn't. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. According to sources close to the situation, Greene had been documenting these conversations, not for some grand expose, she's not suddenly becoming a whistleblower, but because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. When you've built your entire identity around fighting the establishment and then discover you've become part of the very machinery you claim to oppose, that cognitive dissonance creates a paper trail of its own. One source described seeing her handwritten notes from a particularly brutal strategy meeting where she was told that her job wasn't to reduce government spending. It was to complain about government spending loudly enough to generate campaign contributions from people who hate government spending. The circular logic was apparently so blatant that even Greene, who's never been accused of overthinking political strategy, couldn't ignore it anymore. Now, here's where this gets really interesting and why every American should be paying attention regardless of their political affiliation. If the reports about Greene's reasoning are accurate, then we're witnessing something unprecedented, a politician choosing principles over profit, even when those principles conflict with her party's immediate interests. That's not supposed to happen in modern American politics. The system is specifically designed to prevent it from happening. The fact that it's happening anyway suggests that the contradictions within our political system have reached a breaking point that even the most loyal operatives can't ignore anymore. So what happens next? If Greene actually follows through on her reported decision, it won't just leave an empty seat in Congress. It will leave a question that every other politician will have to answer. Are you here to serve your constituents, or are you here to serve the people who profit from keeping your constituents angry and divided? The answer to that question will determine whether American democracy survives the next decade. Because the current system, where political theater matters more than policy results, where fundraising trumps governance, where loyalty to donors supersedes loyalty to voters, that system is unsustainable. It's producing politicians who can't solve problems even when they want to, because solving problems would threaten the business model that keeps them in power. Greene's story, whatever its ultimate outcome, represents a crack in that system. And cracks, as we know from history, have a tendency to spread. The question isn't whether Marjorie Taylor Greene made the right decision. The question is whether the rest of us will learn from her story before it's too late to save what's left of our democratic institutions. Because if politicians from across the political spectrum are starting to recognize that the system itself is the problem, then we're either on the verge of the most significant political realignment in American history, or we're about to watch our democracy collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And that, folks, is a story worth staying awake for.